What if the greatest betrayal in human history was actually an act of love? What if the man whose name became synonymous with treachery was trying to save the very person he destroyed? Tonight, you will see the gospel through the eyes of history's most hated disciple and discover that the line between salvation and damnation is thinner than you ever imagined. The morning light filters through the narrow window of a modest stone dwelling in Kerioth, casting long shadows across a young man's face as he counts silver coins with practiced precision. His fingers move with the careful deliberation of one who has known scarcity, each denarius weighed not just in metal, but in the bread it might buy, the roof it might repair, the future it might secure. This is Judas Iscariot at 24. Keeper of accounts for his father's failing olive press, dream maker for a family drowning in Roman taxes and dwindling harvests. But we who observe from the vantage point of knowing cannot see him as his neighbors do, as the responsible son, the careful steward, the young man with a head for numbers and a heart for his people's suffering. We see the shadow that has not yet fallen, the 30 pieces that have not yet been counted, the kiss that has not yet been given. We see Judas the betrayer before we see Judas the man, and perhaps in this lies our first tragedy, that history has robbed us of the ability to see him as he saw himself in those innocent moments when he still believed his own intentions pure. The coins catch the morning light, each one reflecting a fragment of his face back at him. He has been calculating again, as he does every morning, measuring their resources against their needs, their hope against their reality. His younger sister Rachel needs medicine for the fever that has racked her small body for weeks now. His mother grows thinner each day, refusing her portion so that her children might eat. His father speaks less and less of the business, more and more of distant relatives in Alexandria who might take in the family if the Romans seized their property for unpaid taxes. It is into this world of careful calculations and mounting desperation that the stories first come. A rabbi from Nazareth, they say, who speaks with authority about the kingdom of God. A teacher who calls fishermen from their nets and tax collectors from their booths, promising them places in a realm where the first shall be last and the last shall be first. The stories drift through the marketplace like smoke, intangible yet somehow filling every corner of Judas's consciousness. He tries to dismiss them at first. There have been other teachers, other prophets, other men claiming to speak for the Almighty. Most have ended badly, crucified or stoned or simply faded into the obscurity from which they emerged. But these stories carry a different weight, a different hope. They speak not just of spiritual renewal, but of justice, of a world turned upside down, of the mighty cast down from their thrones and the humble lifted up. The first time Judas sees Jesus, it is from a distance, across the crowded courtyard of the synagogue in Capernaum, where he has traveled to sell their remaining good oil to a merchant who promised a fair price. The rabbi stands at the center of a growing crowd, his voice carrying clearly through the morning air, and there is something in his presence that stops Judas mid-stride. Not the theatrical gestures of the Pharisees or the careful political rhetoric of the Sadducees, but something quieter, deeper, a sense of authority that seems to emanate not from position or learning, but from some inner certainty that Judas has never witnessed in any man. The words Jesus speaks that day lodge themselves in Judas's mind like seeds in fertile ground. Blessed are you who are poor, for yours is the kingdom of God. Blessed are you who hunger now, for you will be satisfied. Blessed are you who weep now, for you will laugh. They are words that seem to speak directly to his family's situation, to the quiet desperation that has become the background music of their daily existence. Here, finally, is someone who understands what it means to count every coin, to make every meal stretch just a little further, to lie awake at night wondering if tomorrow will bring relief or ruin. But it is not just the words that capture him, it is the man himself. Jesus moves through the crowd with a grace that suggests strength without violence, authority without arrogance. When children approach him, he does not wave them away as other teachers do. When a leper calls out from the edge of the gathering, he does not recoil. There is something in his eyes, even viewed from this distance, that suggests he sees not just the surface of things, but their deeper truth. When those eyes briefly meet Judas's across the courtyard, the young man feels as though he has been seen, truly seen, for the first time in his life. The merchant transaction forgotten, Judas finds himself drawn closer, pressing through the crowd until he can hear not just the words but the pauses between them, can see not just the gestures but the expressions that accompany them. This is no madman spinning fantasies, no charlatan preying on desperate hopes. This is someone who speaks of the kingdom of God as though he has walked its streets, who promises justice as though he holds its scales in his own hands. When the teaching ends and the crowd begins to disperse, Judas remains, standing at the edge of the courtyard like a man who has glimpsed something precious through a briefly opened door and cannot bear to turn away. One of Jesus' followers, a big fisherman with calloused hands and a direct manner, notices his lingering. "You have questions, friend?" Peter asks, and there is nothing condescending in his tone, only genuine curiosity. Judas finds his voice with some difficulty. The rabbi speaks of a kingdom where the poor are blessed. Does he mean this literally, or is it metaphor? Peter's laugh is warm, genuine. With Jesus, it's always both. "Come, walk with us. Ask him yourself." And so begins the crossing, though Judas does not recognize it as such at the time. He tells himself he is merely curious, merely hopeful for some word that might ease his family's suffering. He does not acknowledge the deeper hunger that has awakened in him, the longing not just for material relief, but for meaning, for purpose, for a cause worthy of the intelligence and passion he has had no outlet to express in his circumscribed life of account-keeping and worry. The conversation with Jesus that evening is brief but transformative. They sit beside a small fire outside the town, and when Judas explains his family's situation, Jesus listens with an attention so complete, it feels like a form of healing in itself. No advice is offered, no easy platitudes about God's mysterious ways. Instead, Jesus simply says, "Your love for them honors the Father who sees in secret. But tell me, what would you do if you could ease not just their suffering, but the suffering of all who bear such burdens?" The question haunts Judas through the sleepless night that follows. What would he do? The answer comes to him with startling clarity. Anything. He would do anything, risk anything, sacrifice anything to see a world where families like his do not have to choose between medicine and food, where children do not go to bed hungry while their parents calculate debts by candlelight. When morning comes, he seeks out Jesus again, and this time the question he asks is different. "Rabbi, may I follow you?" The response is not what he expects. Jesus studies him for a long moment, and in that gaze Judas feels exposed, as though every thought, every motive, every secret ambition has been laid bare. Finally, Jesus nods slowly. "Come, but understand, to follow me is to take up a cross. The road we walk leads through darkness before it reaches light." At the time, Judas hears only the promise of light. The warning about darkness seems like the natural caution any wise teacher would offer, a test of commitment rather than a prophecy of doom. He cannot imagine, in those first intoxicating days of discipleship, that he will one day look back on this moment as the point where he stepped onto a path that would lead him inexorably toward the most infamous betrayal in human history. The early days of following Jesus are unlike anything Judas has ever experienced. Here is a community bound not by blood or commerce or political necessity, but by shared vision, shared hope, shared love for a teacher who seems to embody everything they have dreamed the Messiah might be. The 12 disciples are as different as men can be, fishermen and tax collectors, zealots and mystics, the educated and the unlettered, yet they find in Jesus and in each other a unity that transcends all their natural divisions. For Judas, accustomed to the lonely burden of managing his family's finances in isolation, the experience of shared purpose is intoxicating. His facility with numbers makes him a natural choice to manage the group's modest treasury, and he takes to the role with enthusiasm. Here at last is a way to use his skills not merely for survival but for something greater, supporting a ministry that he believes will transform the world. The miracles, when they begin, confirm everything Judas has hoped. He watches Jesus heal the sick, feed the hungry, calm the troubled hearts of those who have lost hope, and sees in these acts not just displays of divine power, but glimpses of the world that is coming, the kingdom where suffering will end, where justice will reign, where people like his family will no longer have to live in fear of tomorrow. But as the ministry grows, so does its complexity. The crowds that follow them bring not just adoration but expectation, not just gratitude but demand. Roman officials begin to take notice. Religious leaders grow hostile. The simple message of love and justice becomes entangled in political implications that Jesus himself seems reluctant to address directly. It is during the feeding of the 5,000 that Judas first feels the stirring of doubt, though he does not recognize it as such at the time. The miracle itself is undeniable. He has handled the treasury, knows exactly how much money they have, understands precisely how impossible it should be to feed so many with so little. Yet as he distributes the bread and fish that somehow multiplies in his hands, he finds himself troubled not by the miracle but by its aftermath. The crowd wants to make Jesus king by force. Here is the moment Judas has been waiting for, the teacher he loves finally receiving the recognition and authority he deserves, the opportunity to establish the kingdom in truth, rather than just in word. But Jesus withdraws, slips away from the crowd's enthusiasm as though it were something dangerous rather than something to be embraced. That night, as they camp in the wilderness, Judas approaches Jesus with a confusion he struggles to articulate. "Master, they would have made you king. Was this not the moment we have been preparing for?" Jesus' response is gentle but troubling. "My kingdom is not of this world, Judas. If it were, my servants would fight for it." The words lodge in Judas's mind like a splinter. Not of this world? But what about the poor who are blessed? The hungry who will be satisfied? The oppressed who will be lifted up? How can these promises be fulfilled in some ethereal realm? How can suffering be ended, justice established, the mighty cast down from their thrones, if the kingdom exists only in some spiritual dimension? He pushes down the doubt, tells himself he has misunderstood. Jesus speaks in parables, after all. His meaning is rarely simple or direct. But the seed of confusion has been planted, and it begins to grow in the fertile soil of Judas's practical mind. The trial comes gradually, not as a single test, but as a slow accumulation of moments when the reality of following Jesus diverges from his expectations. There is the day when Jesus weeps over Jerusalem, speaking of its destruction as though it were inevitable rather than something his kingdom might prevent. There is the evening when he speaks of his own death, not as a temporary setback to be overcome, but as a necessary sacrifice, as though defeat were somehow part of the divine plan. Most troubling of all are the increasing conflicts with the religious authorities. Judas watches Jesus cleanse the temple and feels a surge of joy. Finally, direct action against the corrupt system that bleeds the poor through temple taxes and sacrificial requirements. But instead of following up this bold stroke with practical steps toward reform, Jesus speaks in riddles about destroying the temple and raising it in 3 days, alienating potential allies among the Pharisees who might have been won over by a more diplomatic approach. The doubt that has been growing in whispers now begins to speak aloud in Judas's mind. Is Jesus truly the Messiah they have been waiting for? Or is he something else? A holy man, perhaps, a great teacher, but not the political and social revolutionary that the world needs. The question tortures him, because he cannot answer it without betraying either his love for Jesus or his concern for the suffering that continues unabated while they speak of spiritual kingdoms and interior transformation. He tries to discuss his concerns with the other disciples, but finds no understanding there. Peter's faith is simple and absolute. Jesus is the Christ, and that is enough. John speaks of love and light as though these abstractions could somehow feed hungry children or heal sick sisters. The others seem content to follow without questioning, to believe without understanding, to hope without demanding practical results. Only in Jesus himself does Judas find someone who seems to share his concern for the world's suffering, but even these conversations become increasingly cryptic. When Judas asks directly how the kingdom will address poverty, Jesus speaks of treasures in heaven. When he inquires about justice for the oppressed, Jesus talks about forgiving enemies and turning the other cheek. It is as though they are speaking different languages, using the same words to mean entirely different things. The revelation comes not in a moment of dramatic illumination, but through a slow, terrible dawning of understanding. They are in Jerusalem for what Jesus has told them will be his final Passover, and the city buzzes with tension. Pilate has brought extra troops. The Sanhedrin meets in closed session. The very air seems charged with expectation, as though some great event is inevitable. But instead of seizing this moment of maximum opportunity, Jesus seems to be deliberately courting disaster. His teaching in the temple becomes more confrontational, his criticism of the religious leaders more direct. He speaks openly of his approaching death, not as a possibility to be avoided, but as a destiny to be embraced. It is during the supper in the upper room that understanding finally breaks over Judas like a wave. As Jesus kneels to wash the disciples' feet, the act of a servant, not a king, and speaks of being betrayed by one of them, the full horror of the situation becomes clear. Jesus knows what is coming. He has always known. The arrest, the trial, the crucifixion, all of it is somehow part of his plan. But what kind of plan involves the defeat and death of the one person who could have changed everything? What kind of Messiah deliberately walks into the hands of his enemies? What kind of kingdom is established through the destruction of its king? The pieces of the puzzle that had been scattered through 3 years of ministry suddenly arrange themselves into a picture that Judas finds unbearable to contemplate. Jesus does not intend to establish an earthly kingdom. He does not plan to overthrow the Romans, or reform the religious system, or address the practical needs of the suffering masses. He intends to die, and somehow in that death to accomplish something that Judas cannot understand but knows he cannot accept. The moment when Jesus hands him the morsel of bread and says quietly, "What you are going to do quickly," feels like a falling away of the last pretense between them. Jesus knows, has always known, and in that knowledge lies both an invitation and a release. Permission to do what Judas has been wrestling with for weeks. Authorization to choose the path that logic and love for suffering humanity seem to demand. As he leaves the upper room, the silver pieces already promised him heavy in his mind, Judas tells himself that he is saving Jesus from himself. If Jesus will not act to claim his rightful place as the leader their people need, then perhaps being forced into a confrontation with the authorities will compel him to reveal his true power. Perhaps this betrayal is not betrayal at all, but a form of love, the harsh intervention necessary to push a reluctant Messiah into embracing his destiny. The night air is cold against his face as he makes his way through Jerusalem's narrow streets toward the house of Caiaphas. Above him, stars wheel in their ancient patterns, indifferent to the human drama playing out below. He thinks of his family in Kerioth, still struggling, still suffering, still waiting for the deliverance that Jesus could provide but seems determined to withhold. He thinks of all the poor and oppressed throughout Judea who pin their hopes on a Messiah who speaks of spiritual transformation while leaving their material circumstances unchanged. By the time he reaches the high priest's house, Judas has convinced himself that what he is about to do is not just justifiable but necessary. Jesus must be forced to act. The kingdom must be established. The suffering must end. And if it takes betrayal to accomplish these things, then betrayal it must be. The transaction with the priests is brief and businesslike. 30 pieces of silver, the price of a slave under Roman law, though none of them acknowledge this symbolism aloud. The arrangements are simple. He will lead them to Jesus when the teacher is away from the crowds, identify him with a kiss so there can be no mistaking their target in the darkness. As he weighs the coins in his hand afterward, Judas feels not triumph but a strange emptiness. This silver is different from the coins he counted so carefully in his father's house. Those represented honest work, careful stewardship, love for his family. These represent something else entirely, a transaction whose true cost he is only beginning to understand. The Garden of Gethsemane lies in darkness when they arrive, the soldiers' torches creating dancing shadows among the olive trees. Judas knows this place well. They have come here often during their time in Jerusalem, drawn by its quiet beauty and its distance from the city's crowds. Jesus will be here, probably praying as has become his custom in these final days. He finds the teacher exactly where expected, kneeling among the gnarled olive trees, his face turned toward heaven in the starlight. For a moment, watching from the edge of the garden, Judas feels his resolution waver. There is something in Jesus' posture, something in the way the shadows fall across his features, that suggests not a man avoiding his destiny, but one embracing it with terrible certainty. The other disciples sleep nearby, exhausted by the emotional weight of the evening's events. They look like children in the uncertain light, faces peaceful in unconsciousness, unaware that their world is about to shatter. Peter mutters something in his sleep and turns over, one hand still resting on the sword he has brought despite Jesus' teachings about nonviolence. When Jesus rises from his prayers and sees Judas approaching, there is no surprise in his eyes, no accusation, only a sadness so deep it seems to contain all the sorrow of the world. "Friend," he says quietly, "do what you came to do." The kiss, when Judas gives it, tastes of salt, whether from tears or sweat or the night air itself, he cannot tell. It is meant to be the simple sign they agreed upon, a way to identify Jesus in the darkness. But in the moment their lips meet, it becomes something else entirely. A final moment of intimacy between teacher and student. A goodbye that carries within it all the love and disappointment and tragic necessity of what is about to unfold. The soldiers move quickly after that, surrounding Jesus with practiced efficiency. The disciples wake in confusion, reaching for weapons that Jesus forbids them to use. There is a brief scuffle. Peter draws his sword and cuts off the ear of the high priest's servant. But Jesus ends it with a word, healing the wound with a touch, and surrendering himself to the authorities with a dignity that makes Judas's stomach clench with something he is not yet ready to call regret. As they lead Jesus away, bound and surrounded by soldiers, he turns once to look back at Judas. Their eyes meet for a final time. And in that gaze, Judas sees not anger or condemnation, but something far worse: pity. Not pity for what Judas has done, but pity for what he has failed to understand. The price begins to reveal itself almost immediately. As the procession disappears into the darkness, leaving Judas alone among the olive trees with only the sleeping disciples for company, the weight of his decision settles onto his shoulders like a physical burden. The silver pieces in his pocket seem to grow heavier with each step as he makes his way back toward the city. He tells himself that all is proceeding according to plan. Jesus is in custody, which will force him to reveal his divine power and claim his rightful throne. The confrontation with the authorities will become the catalyst for the kingdom's establishment. The suffering of the people will finally come to an end. But even as he repeats these justifications to himself, doubt gnaws at the edges of his certainty. The look in Jesus' eyes haunts him, not the look of a man about to reveal his hidden power, but of one walking knowingly toward his death. The pity he saw there suggests understanding of something Judas himself does not yet grasp. By the time he reaches Jerusalem proper, the first trial is already underway in the house of Caiaphas. Judas finds himself drawn to the courtyard, where a crowd of servants and hangers-on wait for news. Peter is there, warming himself by a fire, his face gray with shock and fear. When their eyes meet across the courtyard, the big fisherman's expression shifts from recognition to something approaching hatred. Judas tries to approach him, to explain what he has done and why, but Peter turns away as though the very sight of him is contaminating. The other disciples, those who have not fled entirely, regard him with horror and disgust. He has become, in the space of a few hours, the most hated man among those who were once his brothers. The sounds of the trial drift down from the upper rooms, voices raised in accusation, the thud of blows, cries of pain that might be coming from Jesus himself. Each sound is like a knife in Judas's chest, because they suggest not the triumphant revelation of divine power he expected, but the suffering of an innocent man being brutalized by his enemies. As dawn approaches, the verdict becomes clear. Jesus is to be handed over to the Romans for crucifixion. There will be no last-minute display of power, no angelic army descending to rescue him, no transformation of defeat into victory. There will be only the cross and the slow death that waits upon it. The full horror of what he has set in motion crashes over Judas like a breaking wave. This is not salvation but destruction. This is not the forcing of Jesus into claiming his rightful power, but the delivery of an innocent man to his executioners. All his careful reasoning, all his justifications about the greater good and the needs of the suffering masses collapse before the simple, terrible fact that he has betrayed his friend to death. He runs through the streets of Jerusalem as the sun rises, the 30 pieces of silver burning in his pocket like coals. The city awakens around him, merchants opening their stalls, pilgrims preparing for the day's observances, Roman soldiers changing guard, but he sees none of it. All he can see is Jesus' face in the garden. All he can hear are the sounds of suffering from Caiaphas' house. When he reaches the temple, the priests who paid him are preparing for the morning sacrifice. They greet him with satisfaction, as though he were a successful business partner returning from a profitable venture. The casual nature of their congratulations makes his stomach turn. To them, Jesus is simply a problem that has been solved, a threat that has been neutralized. They do not see the teacher who healed the sick and comforted the mourning. They do not know the man who spoke of love and justice with such authority that even hardened sinners believed redemption was possible. "I have sinned," Judas says, his voice barely above a whisper. "I have betrayed innocent blood." The priests exchange glances, their satisfaction giving way to irritation. This is not part of their plan. Guilt-ridden accomplices are inconvenient, unpredictable. "What is that to us?" one of them says dismissively. "That's your responsibility." The words cut through Judas's soul like a blade. What is that to us? As though the life they have purchased with their silver is merely a commodity. As though the man they have condemned is nothing more than an inconvenience to be disposed of. He sees in their indifference the true nature of what he has become part of. Not a plan to force Jesus into claiming his power, but a conspiracy to destroy a threat to their authority. He throws the silver pieces onto the temple floor, the coins scattering across the marble with a sound like breaking bells. 30 pieces of silver, the price of a slave, the cost of his soul. The priests watch him with cold eyes as he flees the temple, leaving their blood money behind him like an offering to some terrible god. The consequence unfolds with the inexorable logic of Greek tragedy. News reaches him as he wanders the hills outside Jerusalem that Jesus has been crucified, that the teacher who could have saved the world has died like a common criminal between two thieves. The man who spoke of the kingdom of God has been destroyed by the kingdoms of this world, and Judas Iscariot has been the instrument of that destruction. He climbs higher into the hills, away from the city where his name will forever be synonymous with betrayal, away from the places where Jesus taught and healed and showed them all what love might look like when given flesh and breath. The landscape around him is harsh and beautiful, rocks and thorns and wild flowers, the kind of country where prophets come to wrestle with God and sometimes emerge blessed, sometimes broken. But Judas finds no blessing in this wilderness, no wrestling that might lead to redemption. There is only the echo of Jesus' voice speaking of forgiveness even for enemies, of love that extends even to those who betray you, of a kingdom where even the worst sinners might find grace. These teachings, which once seemed to promise hope for all, now feel like accusations. How can there be forgiveness for the unforgivable? How can love extend to one who has destroyed love itself? The tree he chooses is an ancient sycamore, its branches strong enough to bear the weight of his body, its height sufficient to ensure that there will be no surviving this final decision. As he fashions the rope from his belt and cloak, Judas thinks of all the choices that have led him to this moment, the poverty that drove him from his father's house, the hope that drew him to Jesus, the doubt that poisoned his faith, the calculation that convinced him betrayal was justified. Each choice had seemed reasonable at the time. Each step along the path had been taken for what he believed were good reasons. He wanted to serve God, to help establish justice, to end suffering. He wanted to be part of something greater than himself, something that would transform the world. How had such intentions led to such a destination? As he climbs the tree, rope in hand, he can see Jerusalem in the distance, the temple gleaming in the afternoon sun. Somewhere in that city, the other disciples are probably gathering, trying to understand what has happened, struggling to make sense of a world where their teacher is dead and their hopes are shattered. They will go on somehow. Peter with his impulsive faith, John with his mystical certainty, the others with whatever strength they can find in each other, and in the memory of the man they followed. But for Judas, there can be no going on. He is the betrayer, the one whose name will be cursed whenever the story is told. He is the disciple who sold his teacher for 30 pieces of silver, who delivered love into the hands of hatred, who chose the kingdoms of this world over the kingdom of God. There is no redemption possible for such a choice, no forgiveness adequate for such a betrayal. The rope around his neck, Judas Iscariot takes his final step into empty air. His last conscious thought is not of the silver or the kiss or the terrible necessity that drove him to his choice, but of Jesus' eyes in the garden, eyes that held not condemnation but pity, not hatred but a sadness that seemed to encompass all the tragedy of human choice and divine love, intersecting in a world too broken to contain both. Yet even as his body swings from the ancient sycamore, even as his story reaches its inevitable conclusion, the tale itself refuses to end. For we who tell it, we who know how it concludes, must still wrestle with the questions it raises. Was Judas villain or victim? Was his betrayal the product of greed and malice, or of love and desperation pushed beyond their limits? Was he the agent of divine necessity, playing a role that someone had to play for salvation's drama to unfold? Or was he simply a man who made the worst possible choice in the worst possible moment? The silver pieces he threw down in the temple were used, the scriptures tell us, to buy a field called Akeldama, the field of blood. It serves as a cemetery for strangers, for those who have no other place to rest. Perhaps there is symbolism in this, perhaps not. Perhaps it is merely the practical solution of priests who could not return blood money to the treasury and needed to dispose of it somehow. But the field remains, as does the story, as do the questions that neither theology nor psychology nor history can fully answer. In every age, there are those who see in Judas the epitome of evil, the man so consumed by greed and hatred that he could sell his friend for silver. In every age, there are others who see in him a mirror of their own failures, their own moments of choosing the practical over the ideal, the safe over the heroic, the expedient over the true. And perhaps this is the lesson, if lesson there must be. Not that some men are monsters and others saints, but that we are all capable of both betrayal and redemption, all poised on the knife's edge between love and selfishness, faith and doubt, the kingdom of God and the kingdoms of this world. Judas Iscariot differs from the rest of us not in the nature of his temptation, but in the magnitude of its consequences, not in the quality of his failure, but in the price that was paid for it. The sycamore tree stands empty now, its branches swaying in the wind that comes down from the hills around Jerusalem. The city below continues its ancient rhythms, worship and commerce, politics and prayer, the endless human drama of hope and disappointment playing out in streets that have witnessed the footsteps of prophets and kings, teachers and betrayers, the holy and the broken alike. And somewhere in those streets, In every generation, there walks another Judas, another person faced with the choice between loyalty and expedience, between faith and doubt, between the difficult path of following and the seductive logic of taking control. The silver changes form, sometimes money, sometimes power, sometimes simply the approval of those whose opinions we value more than truth. The kiss remains the same, the intimate gesture that masks the deepest betrayal, the sign of affection that delivers love into the hands of its enemies. But the story does not end with betrayal, does not conclude with the swinging rope, or the scattered silver, or even with the cross itself. For those who remain, those who must go on living in the aftermath of tragedy, there is still the possibility of understanding, still the hope of redemption, still the whisper of a love that extends even to those who have fallen furthest from grace. The gospel through Judas's eyes is not a different gospel, but the same gospel seen from the darkest possible angle, the good news of God's love proclaimed even for those who believe themselves beyond the reach of any good news, the promise of forgiveness extended even to those who are convinced they have committed the unforgivable sin. It is the story of how even the worst betrayal cannot finally defeat love, how even the deepest failure cannot exhaust grace, how even the most tragic ending cannot silence the hope that speaks of new beginnings. In the end, perhaps that is what makes Judas's story so compelling and so terrible, not that he was a monster, but that he was a man. Not that his motives were pure evil, but that they were recognizably human. Not that his choice was incomprehensible, but that it was the logical conclusion of a process of reasoning that any of us might follow, under the right circumstances. And not that his fate was inevitable, but that it was chosen by someone who loved his teacher enough to betray him, who cared about justice enough to pervert it, who believed in the kingdom of God enough to try to force it into existence on his own terms. The field of blood remains, a reminder of the price of such choices. But so does the gospel, with its inexhaustible message of grace even for those who believe themselves beyond grace, forgiveness even for those who consider themselves unforgivable, love even for those who have betrayed love itself. And in that continuing proclamation, perhaps even Judas Iscariot might find, if not redemption, then at least the hope that his story serves some purpose greater than mere tragedy, the purpose of reminding us all that no one is so far from grace that grace cannot find them, no one so lost that love cannot seek them out, no one so broken that healing is impossible.